The desert had been quiet for days before they broke through the final layer of stone. It was 2009, and the engineers of a Special Forces detachment at Kandahar airfield had been ordered to survey a patch of uneven terrain just beyond the perimeter wall. The ground there was different, denser, older. When the first slab gave way, a breath of stale air drifted upward. So dry and unmoving, it felt preserved rather than lifeless. One man muttered that it smelled like the inside of a sealed museum exhibit, but no one laughed. They lowered a light into the darkness and saw stairs descending into the earth. Inside, their headlamps painted the walls in narrow beams of white. The chamber stretched farther than they expected, its architecture rough but deliberate. Along the walls ran shallow carvings, rows of curved symbols that looked to an untrained eye like the scripts found in ancient Sumerian tablets. But this was Afghanistan, thousands of miles from that cradle of language. The glyphs were etched with care, but some were half erased, as if the stone itself had tried to forget. No one spoke for several minutes. They photographed everything, marked coordinates, logged oxygen levels. The air refused to circulate, yet it did not suffocate them. It simply hung there, waiting. The first flicker came through the comms when they reached the far wall. A single burst of static cracked through the headset, then silence. The radio operator adjusted his channel, thinking he'd brushed the wrong frequency. But the noise returned, so faint it almost resembled breathing through a speaker. Each man, one by one, reported the same interference. Even when they powered down their radios, a low rhythmic hum remained, faint as the pulse of something alive under layers of rock. The kind of sound that slips past logic and into the body, where explanation no longer helps. Later that night, when they reviewed the recordings, the hum was still there, constant, unbroken. It rose slightly whenever someone spoke near the carvings, as if the sound itself was listening. No one mentioned it in the daily log. The entry simply read, "Chamber located, unstable structure. Investigation postponed." Outside, the desert wind pressed against the camp fencing like an ocean tide. And beneath it all, the ground kept humming. Too low for words, too old for origin. Sergeant Miller had spent enough years in the field to recognize the shapes of ordinary interference. Static had patterns, an accidental rhythm born of wind, altitude, and cheap wiring. But that night, while reviewing signal logs in the dim comms tent, he heard something else. The noise came softly at first, a breath tangled in white hiss, like someone leaning too close to a microphone. Then a pause, followed by a single word. His name, whispered slowly, stretched across the channel as though spoken from a distance that wasn't measured in miles. He froze, headphones still in place, eyes fixed on the flickering waveform on the laptop screen. The transmission lasted less than 6 seconds. He replayed it, the whisper repeated, this time accompanied by a faint sequence of syllables that didn't belong to any language he recognized. He ran a frequency analysis. No spikes, no background chatter, just a voice where none should have been. He checked the logbook. No outgoing transmissions. No patrols near their frequency band. Still, the hum from the previous day lingered under the recording like a heartbeat that refused to fade. By morning, curiosity had become protocol. Miller extracted the file, labeled it interference test, and passed it up to the intelligence liaison. Within hours it came back marked reviewed, no anomaly detected. That was the phrase the military used when something didn't fit any category. Miller tried again, sending it to a civilian linguist attached to the reconstruction effort. The response was polite but uncertain. The voice contained phonetic elements similar to early Akkadian, yet the syntax was impossible. If it's human, the analyst wrote, it's a reconstruction of something we no longer speak. After that night, none of the men slept underground. They said the air in the chamber felt charged, like a speaker just before feedback. Radios were kept off except during mandatory check-ins. The hum, however, continued even in silence. Some claimed they could feel it vibrating faintly through the cot frames, as though the earth itself was whispering beneath their rest. When command requested daily logs, the entries returned to routine language. Weather, supply, morale. The file labeled interference test was quietly deleted. Only Miller kept a copy, buried in his personal drive, where it still played the same whisper, looping without end. The report that left Kandahar never mentioned voices. It arrived at headquarters written in the flat, clinical language that made all strange things sound ordinary. Subterranean discovery, site sealed, Potential structural instability. Recommend personnel reassignment pending psychological evaluation. At the bottom, a new phrase appeared in smaller type. Psychological contamination risk. No one could recall seeing that classification before. Within a week, every member of the engineering unit was rotated out to different sectors, each under separate commands. The transfer orders were routine, but the timing was too neat to be coincidence. The chamber entrance was filled in, welded shut beneath a steel plate. Equipment logs showed the excavation machinery as diverted to another project. In truth, the men who had stood inside that space were told never to discuss it again, not even among themselves. The hum had faded once the hole was sealed, but at night, some claimed to still hear its pulse through the metal flooring of their quarters. A vibration so soft it could be mistaken for memory. Months later, civilian contractors arrived to repair flood damage near the same coordinates. They spoke with local elders who watched quietly as the machines worked. One old man, wrapped in a white shawl, told the translator that the airfield sat atop a sleeping place for those who remember too much. He said the ground hums because it carries unfinished words. The contractors laughed it off, noting the sound was probably from buried cables. The elder only smiled, repeating that some places never forget what's buried in them. When the maintenance team submitted their end-of-week report, one line from a foreign technician stood out among the dry numbers and soil data. It read, "Audio irregularities detected near sealed coordinates. Recommend inspection." The request was denied the same day. Officially, no excavation ever took place there again. Yet each year, satellite images show a faint circular depression forming around the same patch of earth. Subtle, shifting, and unexplained, like the echo of something still breathing beneath the dust. The cartographer worked the night shift in a low-lit trailer at the edge of the airfield, surrounded by monitors that hummed softly beneath the drone of cooling fans. His task was simple: review satellite overlays from the southern grid, confirm alignment, and flag any distortions caused by sandstorms. Most nights passed in quiet repetition, lines and coordinates moving with mathematical certainty. But that evening, something in the pattern of the terrain felt wrong, subtle but unmistakable. The coordinates of the sealed excavation site appeared shifted, displaced by nearly a mile to the northeast. At first, he suspected an error in calibration. He cross-checked the imagery with archived datasets. Each matched perfectly except for the latest file. The timestamp, checksum, and metadata were all intact, untouched by human editing. Yet when he toggled between the two images, the landscape itself seemed to breathe, like the map had exhaled and redrawn its own shape. The sealed chamber's coordinates now rested on untouched desert. No trace of excavation, no vehicle tracks, no sign that anything had ever been disturbed there. He recalculated using the ground control points, aligning them manually, but each pass brought the same result. The earth had quietly rearranged its memory. He thought of the stories whispered by the Afghan workers, the ground remembering what had been hidden beneath it. He leaned closer to the screen, adjusting contrast until faint shadows surfaced where the old dig should have been. They weren't natural, more like stains in the digital fabric of the terrain itself. He hesitated before saving. The cursor hovered over the export icon, then shifted to delete. The screen dimmed to black, leaving him alone with the low hum of machines. Outside, the desert wind pressed softly against the trailer walls, carrying grains of sand that ticked like clock hands against metal. He backed up his work, logged out, and never mentioned the anomaly in his report. By morning, the coordinates on the system had stabilized again, exactly where they should have been. The map had corrected itself, as though reality had quietly adjusted its borders to protect a secret best left buried. The first time the frequency appeared, it was just after midnight in the western Iraqi desert. The reconnaissance team had been monitoring standard encrypted channels, cataloguing routine chatter from coalition patrols. Then a clean, unmistakable signal broke through, sharp, stable, and carrying NATO-grade encryption. It wasn't the static-laced echo of a pirated broadcast or the crude mimicry of local interference. It was perfect. A voice, calm and unmistakably American, began transmitting coordinates in clipped, deliberate rhythm. The problem was simple. The signal originated from the center of an uninhabited wasteland, 100 miles from the nearest operating base. Sergeant Rhodes, the team's communications lead, logged the frequency, checked the source triangulation, and frowned. The data showed the signal was stationary, broadcasting from a dead zone with no relay towers, no vehicles, no power. The coordinates transmitted matched a dried riverbed that hadn't seen water in decades. He asked for verification from command, standard protocol for unidentified encryption, but the higher channels responded with silence. Only the signal kept speaking, calm as a weather report, repeating the same phrase every 4 minutes. Confirm coordinates. Proceed north by grid 27. They recorded everything. The encryption key matched NATO formatting from the early 1990s, an obsolete sequence that hadn't been used since Operation Sabre during the Gulf War. Still, the clarity was undeniable, almost too perfect, as though the voice were transmitting from inside their own equipment. When Rhodes ran a spectrum analysis, the signal registered with no interference, no compression artifacts, no loss of fidelity across frequencies. It was pure digital presence. The longer they listened, the more wrong it felt. There was no call sign, no end transmission, no fluctuation in tone, just the same measured male voice, looping through the coordinates as though time hadn't moved since the first broadcast. At one point, the team turned off their receiver entirely, yet the faint echo of that same phrase continued, leaking softly through the inactive speakers like a ghost hum, riding on the edge of silence. Rhodes looked at the others, unsure whether to call it malfunction or memory. Either way, something in the desert was still talking, and it was using their language. By dawn, the coordinates had become an obligation. The reconnaissance team, uneasy but compelled, set out across the flat expanse toward the location the voice had repeated all night. The desert stretched endlessly, pale under the rising sun, the kind of silence that erases distance. When they reached the grid, the terrain dipped into a shallow riverbed, dry, cracked, and lifeless. Yet something about the air felt scorched, as if lightning had touched ground there recently. The Geiger counter clicked faintly but without pattern. The sand shimmered with a glassy sheen that looked more like fused soil than heat mirage. Half buried in that hardened layer lay the rusted outlines of old vehicles. Military transport trucks, their frames skeletal and half consumed by sand. The team approached cautiously. One truck still bore a legible serial number. Rhodes rubbed away the dust, recorded the digits, and later matched them to an archived manifest. The result silenced the group. The number belonged to a convoy lost in February 1991, during the first Gulf War, a unit that had vanished in a storm and was presumed destroyed near the Kuwaiti border, hundreds of miles away. The discovery should have ended the investigation, but curiosity held them there. Inside the truck's cab, the air smelled sharp and electric, like ozone after a lightning strike. The controls were fused, the seats collapsed into brittle powder, yet a headset hung from the dash, its coiled cable half melted. When they lifted it, a faint pulse of sound whispered through. The same frequency, the same calm voice murmuring coordinates as if no time had passed. The device wasn't connected to any power source. They placed it on the sand and stepped back, letting the signal play. The voice faded and returned in intervals, almost syncing with the wind moving across the basin. No one spoke. The landscape felt suspended, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. When they finally packed up to leave, Rhodes marked the coordinates once more, though he knew they would change again. As the truck pulled away, the last thing he heard through the static was the same transmission. Steady, unwavering, and old enough to belong to the dead. Back at the Forward Operations Center, the recording from the riverbed was uploaded to the signal analysis unit. The technicians treated it like any other intercepted transmission. Break it down, decode the layers, trace the origin. Within hours, fragments began to emerge. The encryption pattern matched a known NATO structure retired in 1992, complete with authentic call signs and command exchanges. The chatter was mundane, almost procedural. Route confirmations, logistics codes, references to a weather disturbance. The metadata tagged the transmission to Operation Sabre, an offensive last recorded in early 1991. That alone was strange enough, but the transcript contained one line not listed in any archived comms. "We are still inbound." The phrase repeated twice, both times in the same voice. Calm, steady, without static degradation. Analysts verified the waveform against historical recordings from Sabre units, but no match appeared. The accent, cadence, and tonal profile belonged to no known speaker. Still, the phrasing was perfect military English, unaccented and disciplined. They concluded it must be a signal ghost, an echo bouncing between old relay satellites, distorted by atmospheric conditions. The report recommended tagging it as a non-persistent anomaly. Weeks later, a linguist noticed something the others hadn't. The timestamp embedded in the digital signature showed a creation date exactly 24 hours after the original Sabre transmissions had ceased. It wasn't an echo, it was a continuation. The linguist filed an amendment request. By the next morning, the server entry had vanished. No audit trail, no deletion log, only a blank folder labeled EA5 Electronic Anomalies. When Rhodes requested the playback for his own records, the technician in charge shrugged. "It's been pulled for higher review," he said, eyes fixed elsewhere. The copy Rhodes had kept on his field laptop refused to open, displaying only a timecode that flickered, but never advanced. Each time he tried, the device emitted a low electronic hum, identical to the one from Kandahar's chamber years before. He closed the file, disconnected the drive and left it powered down. Some frequencies, he realized, didn't want to be decrypted. They wanted to be remembered exactly as they were first heard. 14 years later, another team was listening. It was 2020, and a group of signal operators stationed near Mosul was conducting a routine nighttime calibration exercise. Their job was straightforward: sweep the electromagnetic spectrum for interference before a planned drone sortie. The air was dry, the horizon glowing faintly with the lights of the city far below. Then, at 02:17, a clean transmission broke through their feed, sharp, precise, almost sterile. At first, they thought it was friendly chatter from a coalition aircraft, but the encryption pattern told a different story. It was obsolete, long decommissioned. NATO Sabre code. The lead operator, a 24-year-old specialist named Faris, verified the signal twice before alerting command. The frequency carried no distortion, no trace of atmospheric interference. The voice that followed was calm and deliberate, issuing the same coordinates that once pointed to the dried riverbed hundreds of miles southwest. "Confirm coordinates. Proceed north by grid 27. The same phrase, the same pauses between syllables, even the same slight inflection at the end of each repetition. Faris dug through archival notes stored in the base server, comparing waveforms out of habit. The match came back at 99% similarity to a classified anomaly recorded in 2006, a file tagged under Electronic Anomalies, EA5. He didn't have access to the full recording, but the metadata told enough. Same voice print, same timing delay, identical checksum signature. Somewhere in the desert, a dead transmission was still alive. When command requested a live relay test, the team attempted to respond on the same frequency. Their broadcast carried out cleanly, but no acknowledgement returned. The original voice continued looping, unbroken, unaware of the intrusion. Faris typed a note into the mission log before closing the file. Same words, same voice. By morning, the transmission was gone. The spectrum sweep showed nothing but the ordinary hum of data streams and power lines. Yet every operator in that room swore they still heard the faint echo long after. The calm voice repeating its coordinates under the buzz of equipment, as if time had folded and one signal had found its way home across decades. The perimeter at Forward Operating Base Al-Hamra was nothing more than a thin line of wire and warning tape, trembling gently in the morning wind. Beyond it stretched a pale horizon of dust and scrub, the kind of landscape that seemed incapable of holding secrets. But on the first morning of April 2011, the sniper assigned to Overwatch spotted movement, a silhouette standing motionless just beyond the wire. The figure faced the base, upright, hands at his sides, neither approaching nor retreating. Through his scope, the sniper could make out the outline of a uniform, though the fabric looked washed of all color, bleached into the same tone as the desert around it. He called it in. The thermal scope came up next, but the screen showed nothing. No body heat, no electronic signature, just the soft glow of the rising sun behind static air. The duty officer ordered a flare fired in the figure's direction. When the smoke cleared, the space was empty. Standard procedure followed. Perimeter sweep, drone scan, nothing unusual found. The report noted visual anomaly and moved on. Yet the next dawn, the figure was there again, standing in the same position. The sniper thought it might be a local watching the base, perhaps a farmer displaced by the fighting. But the stance was too formal, the stillness deliberate. For 5 consecutive mornings, the figure appeared, always at the same hour, 05:43. Each time, no thermal trace. The men began timing it, waiting quietly for the shape to emerge from the shimmer of heat and dust, like a ritual neither side could explain. On the 5th day, as the sun climbed over the ridgeline, the sniper watched through his scope, breath steady, expecting another disappearance. Instead, the figure lifted its right hand slowly, palm forward, and offered a crisp salute. The gesture was precise, military, practiced. For a long moment it held, framed against the empty horizon. Then, as the heat began to rise off the sand, the outline dissolved into the wavering air, leaving behind only the glint of wire trembling in the wind. The sniper lowered his rifle and whispered, almost reflexively, "Return salute." Years later, long after the war had begun to blur into fragments of memory, 2 men found themselves in the same rehabilitation center outside Ramstein. Both were veterans of special operations units, separated by time, by mission, by everything, except the quiet wait that follows those who have seen too much. Their sessions were scheduled at different hours, yet one afternoon their paths crossed in the corridor outside the therapy wing. A single conversation, a remark about early mornings and insomnia, drew them into the same room. The first to speak was the sniper from Helmand. He described it casually at first, the way soldiers talk about superstition they no longer believe but can't forget. "Every dawn for 5 days," he said. "Same man outside the wire. No heat, no shadow, just the air around him moving." The therapist took notes, nodding gently. The second operator, a communications specialist who had served in northern Syria 3 years later, paused mid-sentence. His pen fell from his hand. "Wait," he said, "you saw him too?" Without prompting, he described an identical figure, standing beyond the perimeter of a field outpost. Same posture, same faint salute as the sun broke the horizon. He remembered the light on the figure's shoulder, the strange absence of weight in its stance. Neither man had read the other's reports, and their deployments had never overlapped. Their voices lowered as they compared details, each realization deepening the stillness in the room. The therapist called it a shared combat mirage, a known psychological phenomenon where isolated soldiers under stress project familiar shapes into the landscape. The diagnosis was neat, clinical, and comforting. But afterward, the men sat together in silence, staring at the tiled floor. There was something in the precision of their memories, the identical minute when the figure appeared, the salute held just long enough to feel seen, that refused to fade into the realm of illusion. They did not argue with the diagnosis. They simply accepted it outwardly, as soldiers do with orders. Yet when the session ended, neither man left immediately. They lingered by the window, waiting for the light to change, as if expecting someone familiar to appear just beyond the glass. Months after that session, a civilian imagery analyst combing through archived drone footage found a frame that didn't belong. It appeared during a sequence of surveillance captures over southern Afghanistan, an ordinary set of reconnaissance stills taken years earlier. In one image, time-stamped 0543, a faint silhouette stood just beyond the perimeter fence of a temporary forward outpost. The figure's outline was incomplete, blurred by heat distortion, yet undeniably human in form, upright, motionless, facing the camera as though aware of being watched. At first, the analyst dismissed it as a lens artifact, the kind that sometimes occurs when sunlight refracts through the drone's protective dome. Still, habit made him cross-check coordinates and metadata. That's when he noticed something strange. The timestamp matched not only the sniper's reported sighting in Helmand, but also the communications specialist's encounter in Syria years later. Different theaters, same local time, same precise minute. It was statistically impossible, yet the pattern sat quietly in the data, asking no questions, offering no answers. When the file reached the review board, the image was categorized under environmental anomalies. The summary note read, "Thermal interference, no identifiable personnel present." The analysts moved on, but the technician who filed it couldn't shake the sense that the figure was not captured by the lens, but somehow through it, as if the camera had become a brief window between moments, separated by years. He printed the still on matte paper, thinking the grain might reveal more than the screen did. Instead, the outline seemed fainter, dissolving each time the light shifted across it. Eventually, he pinned it to the corner of his workstation, where it remained unnoticed among calibration charts and maps. Sometimes, during long shifts, he swore the angle of the head changed slightly, tilting just enough to meet his gaze before the room lights flickered. By the time anyone else looked, it was gone again. reduced once more to the plausible comfort of a technical flaw. By 2023, the wars had receded into memory, scattered across reports and archived footage. The sniper, older now, his beard grey, his gait slower, worked as a security consultant at a logistics port in Djibouti. His job was simple: monitor the perimeter, oversee the guards, make sure the cameras caught everything the human eye might miss. He had long since stopped thinking about the figure in Helmand, the salutes, the stories told in therapy rooms that felt too quiet to hold the truth. The desert here was different, hotter, emptier, yet somehow familiar in the way silence always is. One morning, as the first light bled over the sea, he walked the fence line with a mug of coffee and the easy tiredness of routine. The horizon shimmered in faint waves, the air thick with dust carried from inland. Then, at the far end of the fence, he saw a man standing still against the dawn, tall, motionless, facing the base. The same outline, the same unyielding posture. No weapon, no movement, just presence. For a moment, the consultant thought his eyes were betraying him, translating old memory onto new ground. But when the figure raised its right hand in a slow, deliberate salute, every doubt fell away. He didn't call it in, didn't radio the guards or check the monitors. He simply stood there, hand tightening around the mug, feeling the same stillness he once felt years ago, the pause between breath and understanding. When the figure lowered its arm, the rising light bent across the wire, and the man began to dissolve, his shape swallowed by the heat before the sun fully broke the horizon. The consultant whispered, almost instinctively, "Welcome back." Later, when reviewing the security feed, the cameras showed nothing. The timestamp skipped 12 seconds, the footage resuming with an empty frame of fence and sand. He stared at the blank space for a long time, calm rather than shaken. The wars were over, but some parts of them still stood watch, greeting dawn after dawn, waiting for someone who remembered to answer the salute. Haunting, in the language of soldiers, has little to do with the dead. It is not about spirits, nor punishment, nor the flicker of something unseen in the dark. It is memory, returning, replaying, reshaping itself when the noise finally fades, when the engines stop, when the radios go quiet. The things left unresolved in war don't vanish. They learn how to wait. They hum softly through the years, finding their way back through frequencies, through dreams, through the space between waking and remembering. The men who lived those moments rarely call them hauntings. They call them echoes, or simply the past checking in. The stories never demanded belief, whether it was a whisper in the headset, a voice on a ghost frequency, or a figure saluting from beyond the wire. Each event shared one truth. Someone was still out there, reaching across time with the discipline of duty. Those who witnessed them didn't chase explanations. They learned to listen. Because in war, silence is never empty. It's crowded with the weight of things unsaid. Psychologists file these experiences under stress reactions or temporal illusions. Yet that language misses what the men themselves understand, that a haunting can also be an act of remembrance. To remember is to keep something alive, even if only in signal or shadow. A soldier haunted by a sound or a vision is, in some way, refusing to forget. The hum beneath Kandahar, the phantom transmission over Iraq, the figure who saluted at dawn. All of them part of the same long memory, looping quietly beneath the static of history. In the end, haunting is not a warning. It's a form of companionship, carried forward by those who listened and by those who still will. Radios hum, coordinates drift, perimeters fade, but the presence remains, steady, patient, and strangely kind. When a veteran stares across an empty field and hears a sound no one else does, it isn't fear that moves through him. It's recognition, the past saying softly, "You're still here, so am I." And in that quiet acknowledgement, something unspoken finds peace.